The streetlights cast long shadows across the narrow sidewalk as Marcus Thorne made his way home, his leather briefcase swinging gently at his side. The evening air carried the first hints of autumn, and after 14 hours at the city council working on community development projects, all he wanted was to get home to James, his husband of 12 years. The governor would probably be working late again, but Marcus looked forward to at least sharing a quiet late dinner together. He'd taken this shortcut dozens of times before, a quiet residential street that shaved 10 minutes off his usual route. The old brick buildings lining the street had character, their weathered facades telling stories of decades gone by. As he passed the local fire station, its red doors gleaming under the security lights, Marcus noticed movement in his peripheral vision. A group of firefighters was finishing up what appeared to be an evening training session, their navy blue t-shirts dark with sweat as they rolled up hoses and stored equipment. Under normal circumstances, Marcus would have smiled and nodded respectfully. These were public servants, after all, and he'd always advocated for better funding for emergency services in his role as a community liaison. But something felt off about their body language. The way they stopped their tasks to watch him pass. The way their conversations dropped to whispers, followed by snickers that carried across the empty street. Marcus quickened his pace slightly, his dress shoes clicking against the concrete. "Hey there, pretty boy," a deep voice called out. "Bit late to be prancing through this neighborhood, isn't it?" Marcus's spine stiffened, but he kept walking, maintaining his dignity. Heavy footsteps approached from behind, and suddenly a tall figure stepped directly into his path. The firefighter towered over Marcus, his muscled frame blocking the streetlight and casting Marcus's face in shadow. "I said hello," the man repeated, his tone dripping with false politeness. "Don't they teach manners wherever you're from?" Marcus took a steadying breath, drawing on years of experience handling difficult situations in public service. "Good evening," he replied evenly. "I'm just heading home. If you'll excuse me, he tried to step around the firefighter, but two more had approached, forming a loose circle around him. Marcus's heart began to race, though he fought to keep his expression neutral. He could smell their sweat, see the cruel amusement in their eyes as they sized him up. "Home? Huh?" Another firefighter chimed in, his voice pitched high in mockery. "And where might that be? The fashion district?" He reached out and flicked Marcus's silk tie. Marcus took another step back, only to bump into a fourth firefighter who had completed the circle. The man grabbed Marcus's shoulders, steadying him with excessive force. "Careful there. Wouldn't want you to scuff those fancy shoes." The first firefighter, clearly the ringleader, moved closer. His name tag read Davidson, and his breath smelled of coffee and cigarettes. "You know, we don't see many of your type around here after dark. Makes us wonder what you might be up to." "I'm a citizen going about my business," Marcus replied, his voice firm despite his rising anxiety. "I have every right to walk home." This earned a chorus of mocking laughter from the group. Davidson leaned in closer, his face inches from Marcus's. "Rights? Oh, we know all about rights. We're public servants, after all, sworn to protect and serve." His lips curved into a cruel smile. "And right now, we're serving notice that maybe you should find another route home." Marcus glanced around, hoping to catch sight of a passing car or another pedestrian. But the street remained deserted. The fire station's windows were dark, and the residential buildings seemed to have their curtains drawn. He was alone with these men, and the realization sent ice through his veins. "My husband will be one. Ring where I am," Marcus said, trying to inject authority into his voice. He'd learned long ago not to hide who he was, even in threatening situations. Sometimes naming his relationship with James carried weight. People knew the governor had a husband, even if they didn't always know Marcus by sight. But tonight it was exactly the wrong thing to say. Davidson's eyes lit up with malicious glee. "Oh, your husband? Well, isn't that precious? Boys, we better make sure this gentleman gets home safe and sound to his husband." The circle tightened, and Marcus felt the first real tendrils of fear wrap around his chest. He'd dealt with prejudice before, had faced down angry constituents and weathered political storms, but this was different. These men had power, authority, and worst of all, complete confidence in their immunity from consequences. Please, Marcus said, hating the slight tremor in his voice. I don't want any trouble. Trouble? Davidson's smile widened. No trouble at all. We're just doing our civic duty, making sure our streets are safe. And you know what they say about safety. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. The other firefighters chuckled, and Marcus saw one of them move toward the coiled hoses they'd been storing. His heart sank as he realized this wasn't going to end with just threats and intimidation. These men had something specific in mind, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the streetlights flickered to full brightness, Marcus Thorne stood surrounded by the very people sworn to protect their community, about to learn just how far they would go to enforce their own brand of justice. And somewhere across town, in the governor's mansion, James was probably just starting to wonder why his husband was running late. The tension in the air was electric, crackling with potential energy, like the moment before a storm breaks. Marcus thought of all the times he'd assured James that taking this shortcut was perfectly safe, how he dismissed his husband's concerns about walking alone at night. Now, as Davidson cracked his knuckles with deliberate slowness, Marcus wished he'd listened. The evening shadows lengthened as Marcus watched another firefighter retrieve the heavy canvas hose, its dark green surface gleaming dully under the streetlights. His mind raced through possible scenarios, each more alarming than the last. He'd spent years in public service, learning to read people and situations, but nothing had prepared him for this level of targeted malice. Davidson's boots scraped against the concrete as he shifted his weight, a predatory gleam in his eyes. You know what, boys? I think our friend here could use a little cooling off. All that walking in his fancy suit must be getting pretty warm. The words hung in the air like smoke, and Marcus felt his stomach clench. He thought of James, probably sitting in his office right now, surrounded by the trappings of power that meant nothing in this darkened street. The governor's authority, their carefully built life together, their work for the community. None of it mattered to these men who saw only what they wanted to see. Think about what you're doing, Marcus said, fighting to keep his voice steady. This isn't going to end well for anyone. One of the younger firefighters, his name tag read Peters, laughed nervously. Hey, Davidson, maybe we should what? Davidson cut him off sharply. Let him strut around our neighborhood like he owns it? Nah, I think it's time for a little lesson in humility. The hose was fully unwound now, its nozzle pointing directly at Marcus's chest. He could hear the water pressure building inside, a low hum that promised violence. The circle of men had widened slightly, and Marcus knew it wasn't to give him room to escape. They were simply staying clear of the splash zone. His expensive wool suit, a birthday gift from James last year, would be ruined. It was such a mundane thought to have at a moment like this. But Marcus's mind latched onto it, perhaps trying to protect him from the full reality of what was about to happen. The suit, dark blue with subtle pinstripes, had been carefully chosen to reflect both professionalism and approachability. James had helped him pick it out, insisting that public servants should look the part while remaining accessible to their constituents. Last chance, Davidson announced, his hand resting on the nozzle control. Want to apologize for disturbing our evening? Maybe promise to find a different route home from now on? Marcus straightened his spine, years of facing down bigotry and prejudice crystallizing into a moment of pure defiance. I have nothing to apologize for. You're the ones who should be ashamed. Wrong answer, pretty boy. The blast of water hit him like a physical blow, driving the air from his lungs. It was shockingly cold, powerful enough to make him stagger backward. His briefcase went flying, paper scattering across the wet pavement like fallen leaves. Marcus tried to turn away, to protect his face, but another firefighter shoved him back into the direct stream. Water filled his nose, his mouth, soaking through every layer of clothing until he could feel his skin turning to ice. The pressure was relentless. Professional-grade equipment turned into a weapon of humiliation. Through the roar of water, he could hear their laughter, see their shadows moving around him as they directed the stream to ensure maximum impact. His feet slipped on the wet concrete, and Marcus went down hard, his knees striking the ground with enough force to send pain shooting up his leg. Still, the water kept coming. He could barely breathe, barely think, his world reduced to the sound of rushing water and cruel laughter. Then, through the chaos, he heard a familiar voice, sharp, authoritative, and filled with rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" "James." Somehow, impossibly, James was here. Marcus tried to look up, to call out, but the water forced his head down. Through streaming eyes, he saw his husband's polished dress shoes stepping into view, saw him moving toward Davidson with righteous fury radiating from every line of his body. "Turn that off immediately," James commanded, his voice carrying the weight of decades in public office. "I said turn it off." But the firefighters, caught up in their power trip and still not recognizing who was confronting them, only laughed harder. Davidson adjusted his grip on the hose, and suddenly the stream shifted, catching James full in the chest and sending him stumbling backward. "Look at that!" Davidson crowed. "Another one coming to the rescue. Must be the husband he was talking about. Well, plenty of water to go around. Ain't that right, boys?" The water now alternated between them, soaking them both as James tried repeatedly to stand, to reach Marcus, to assert his authority. But the pressure was too strong, the concrete too slippery, and soon both men were on the ground, gasping and sputtering as the firefighters continued their assault. Marcus managed to reach out, his fingers finding James's hand in the chaos. They gripped each other tightly, a small gesture of defiance and unity in the face of this senseless cruelty. Through the wall of water, Marcus could see the rage and helplessness in his husband's eyes, emotions he'd never associated with the powerful, confident man who led their state. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only minutes, the water finally stopped. Davidson and his crew, satisfied with their work, began laughing and congratulating each other as they prepared to head back inside. They seemed completely unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the magnitude of their mistake. "Let that be a lesson," Davidson called over his shoulder as he coiled up the hose. "Find another way home next time." The group of firefighters retreated toward the station, their laughter echoing off the brick buildings. They left behind two thoroughly soaked men, scattered papers floating in puddles, and a briefcase lying broken on its side, along with any illusions about the limits of human cruelty. James was the first to push himself up, water streaming from his ruined suit as he helped Marcus to his feet. They stood there, dripping and shivering in the evening air, holding onto each other for support. The governor's face was a mask of controlled fury, his jaw clenched so tight Marcus could see the muscles jumping. "Are you hurt?" James asked softly, his hands gentle as they checked Marcus for injuries. "My knee," Marcus admitted, testing his weight on it. "And my pride." "James, I'm so sorry. If I hadn't taken this shortcut dash, don't." James cut him off firmly. "Don't you dare apologize for their actions. This isn't your fault." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Several people had their phones out, recording the aftermath of the incident. Marcus could hear murmurs of recognition as people realized who they were seeing. Their governor and his husband, soaked to the skin and clearly victims of an attack. A young woman approached cautiously, holding out her phone. I recorded the whole thing," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "From the moment they surrounded you. I was too scared to intervene, but I knew someone needed to document it." James reached out to take her hand, his gratitude evident despite his bedraggled appearance. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You did exactly the right thing. May I have your contact information? We're going to need that footage." As more people gathered, offering help and expressing their outrage, Marcus leaned heavily against his husband. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him shaking and cold. But beneath the physical discomfort, a steel core of determination was forming. He looked at James and saw the same resolve in his eyes. Those firefighters had no idea what they'd just done, who they'd attacked, what forces they'd set in motion. They thought they were teaching a lesson, asserting their power over someone they saw as vulnerable. Instead, they'd given Marcus and James the ammunition needed to force real change. Tomorrow, there would be press conferences and investigations. There would be outrage and calls for justice. The long work of reform would begin. But for now, as the evening grew darker and colder, two men stood together in their ruined suits, their love and determination stronger than any force of water or hatred that had tried to knock them down. A passerby offered them blankets from her car, while another helped gather the scattered, sodden papers from Marcus's briefcase. The community was already rallying around them, showing that for every act of cruelty, there were countless more acts of kindness waiting to balance the scales. James pulled Marcus closer, pressing a gentle kiss to his temple. "They have no idea what's coming," he whispered, and despite everything, Marcus felt a smile tugging at his lips. Because he knew his husband, knew the force of nature he could be when confronting injustice. Those firefighters thought they'd won tonight, but they'd just started a battle they were destined to lose. As they waited for their security detail to arrive, alerted by the growing crowd and social media buzz, Marcus looked back at the fire station. The windows were dark now, the perpetrators probably congratulating themselves on putting someone in their place. Let them enjoy their victory for one night. Tomorrow, they would learn what it truly meant to face justice. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, not fire trucks this time, but police cars responding to multiple calls from concerned citizens. The night that had started with a simple walk home had transformed into something much bigger, a catalyst for change that would ripple through their community for years to come. The station, their laughter echoing off the brick buildings. They left behind 2 thoroughly soaked men, scattered papers floating in puddles, and a briefcase lying broken on its side, along with any illusions about the limits of human cruelty. James was the first to push himself up, water streaming from his ruined suit as he helped Marcus to his feet. They stood there, dripping and shivering in the evening air, holding onto each other for support. The governor's face was a mask of controlled fury, his jaw clenched so tight Marcus could see the muscles jumping. "Are you hurt?" James asked softly, his hands gentle as they checked Marcus for injuries. "My knee," Marcus admitted, testing his weight on it. "And my pride." "James, I'm so sorry. If I hadn't taken this shortcut dash, don't." James cut him off firmly. "Don't you dare apologize for their actions. This isn't your fault." A small crowd had begun to gather, drawn by the commotion. Several people had their phones out, recording the aftermath of the incident. Marcus could hear murmurs of recognition as people realized who they were seeing. Their governor and his husband, soaked to the skin and clearly victims of an attack. A young woman approached cautiously, holding out her phone. I recorded the whole thing," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "From the moment they surrounded you. I was too scared to intervene, but I knew someone needed to document it." James reached out to take her hand, his gratitude evident despite his bedraggled appearance. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You did exactly the right thing. May I have your contact information? We're going to need that footage." As more people gathered, offering help and expressing their outrage, Marcus leaned heavily against his husband. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him shaking and cold. But beneath the physical discomfort, a steel core of determination was forming. He looked at James and saw the same resolve in his eyes. Those firefighters had no idea what they'd just done, who they'd attacked, what forces they'd set in motion. They thought they were teaching a lesson, asserting their power over someone they saw as vulnerable. Instead, they'd given Marcus and James the ammunition needed to force real change. Tomorrow, there would be press conferences and investigations. There would be outrage and calls for justice. The long work of reform would begin. But for now, as the evening grew darker and colder, 2 men stood together in their ruined suits, their love and determination stronger than any force of water or hatred that had tried to knock them down. A passerby offered them blankets from her car, while another helped gather the scattered, sodden papers from Marcus's briefcase. The community was already rallying around them, showing that for every act of cruelty, there were countless more acts of kindness waiting to balance the scales. James pulled Marcus closer, pressing a gentle kiss to his temple. "They have no idea what's coming," he whispered, and despite everything, Marcus felt a smile tugging at his lips. Because he knew his husband, knew the force of nature he could be when confronting injustice. Those firefighters thought they'd won tonight, but they'd just started a battle they were destined to lose. As they waited for their security detail to arrive, Alerted by the growing crowd and social media buzz, Marcus looked back at the fire station. The windows were dark now, the perpetrators probably congratulating themselves on putting someone in their place. Let them enjoy their victory for one night. Tomorrow, they would learn what it truly meant to face justice. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air, not fire trucks this time, but police cars responding to multiple calls from concerned citizens. The night that had started with a simple walk home had transformed into something much bigger, a catalyst for change that would ripple through their community for years to come. Me. James squeezed Marcus's hand, a gesture that spoke volumes about their shared strength and determination. They had faced discrimination before, had fought countless battles for equality and justice. But this time was different. This time, they had evidence, witnesses, and the full power of the governor's office behind them. The real fight was just beginning, and Marcus knew that together, they would see it through to the end. Not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever faced similar abuse and hadn't had the power to fight back. The night might have been dark, but dawn was coming, and with it, the promise of justice. The first rays of morning sunlight crept through the governor's mansion windows, finding James and Marcus in the study, both still awake from the night before. They'd spent hours reviewing the video footage, making calls, and preparing for the storm they were about to unleash. Marcus's knee was wrapped in bandages, a silent reminder of the previous night's violence. The press conference is scheduled for 9, James said, his voice hoarse from hours of phone calls. He stood behind his desk, his usual impeccable appearance slightly disheveled after the sleepless night. Channel 4 already has the footage running on their morning news. Social media is exploding. Marcus watched the muted television screen where their soaked figures played on repeat. The video was damning. Crystal clear footage showing public servants abusing their power, their cruel laughter audible even over the roar of the water. But what struck him most was the moment James appeared. How quickly the firefighters had turned their assault on him, never imagining they were attacking the state's highest-ranking official. Davidson, Marcus said quietly, reading from the personnel file their staff had assembled overnight. Thomas Davidson, 15 years of service, 3 commendations for bravery, and he paused, his hand tightening on the paper. 2 prior complaints of excessive force that were dismissed during internal reviews. James moved around the desk, placing a gentle hand on Marcus's shoulder. Not this time. This time, everything comes to light. Their private security team had already identified all 6 firefighters involved, building detailed dossiers on each one. The young one who'd hesitated, Peters, had apparently been on the force less than a year. Maybe there was hope for him still, a chance to learn and change. The others, though, their records painted a picture of escalating aggression hidden behind badges of authority. The police chief wants to meet before the press conference, Marcus said, checking his phone. She's horrified. Says she had no idea there was this kind of culture at the station. Or she turned a blind eye, James replied, his tone hard. Either way, that changes now. Every department, every station, we're going to root out this poison. A soft knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah Chun, James's chief of staff, entered with a stack of papers and 2 fresh cups of coffee. Her eyes were rimmed with red. She'd been up all night too, coordinating with media outlets and preparing statements. Morning news coverage is unanimous in its condemnation, she reported, handing them each a coffee. Every major network is running the story. The Firefighters Union has already issued a statement distancing themselves from the incident and promising full cooperation with any investigation. Marcus took a sip of coffee, letting its warmth chase away some of the bone-deep chill that still lingered from the water. And Davidson's crew? Suspended with pay. Pending investigation, Sarah said, her lips twisting in disgust at the with pay part. Standard procedure in these cases. But, she smiled grimly, the DA is already talking about criminal charges. Assault, abuse of power, civil rights violations. They're building quite a list. James moved to the window, looking over the capital city as it woke to what would become one of its most transformative days. It's not enough, he said quietly. Suspensions, charges, those are band-aids. We need systemic change. Marcus stood, ignoring the protest from his injured knee, and joined his husband at the window. Then let's use this, not just to punish them, but to fix the system that created them. They watched the sunrise together, both thinking of the long day ahead. The press conference would be just the beginning. There would be investigations, hearings, policy reforms. They would face resistance from those who benefited from the status quo, who would argue that this was an isolated incident, a few bad apples. But they had the truth on their side, captured in high definition, impossible to deny or explain away. They had the power of James's office and the moral authority of their own experience. Most importantly, they had each other, their partnership forged stronger by adversity. A flurry of activity in the driveway caught their attention. The first news vans were arriving, setting up their equipment for the press conference. Satellite dishes pointed skyward, ready to beam their story across the state and beyond. "We should get ready," Sarah said gently. "The police chief will be here in 30 minutes, and we need to finalize the executive order before the press conference." James nodded, squeezing Marcus's hand one last time before turning back to his desk. The executive order was ambitious, establishing an independent oversight committee for emergency services, mandatory bias training, new reporting requirements for use of force incidents, and a complete review of all past complaints that had been dismissed. "I'll change for the cameras," Marcus said, though part of him wanted to appear exactly as he had last night, showing the world what hate and prejudice looked like up close. But they needed to project strength now, not victimhood. As he headed to their private quarters, Marcus passed dozens of staff members already hard at work. They nodded respectfully, many offering quiet words of support or looks of determination. The governor's mansion was a machine gearing up for war, not with weapons and armies, but with laws, policies, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. In their bedroom, Marcus found his favorite suit laid out, another gift from James, this one chosen for particularly important occasions. As he dressed, he caught sight of himself in the mirror. There were dark circles under his eyes, a small cut on his cheek from when he'd hit the ground, but his gaze was clear and determined. Last night, Davidson and his crew had tried to make him feel small, powerless, unworthy of walking their streets. They'd used water to try to wash away his dignity, his humanity. Instead, they'd washed away any doubt about the need for change, any hesitation about using the full power of the governor's office to transform the system. His phone buzzed, a text from James. "Chief's here early. Ready when you are." Marcus straightened his tie, took one last look in the mirror, and headed back to the study. It was time to show those firefighters, and everyone like them, exactly who they'd messed with. Not just the governor's husband, not just another citizen they thought they could bully with impunity, but a man determined to ensure that what happened to him would never happen to anyone else. The morning sun had fully risen now, promising a clear, bright day. Perfect weather for justice to begin its work. Down in the driveway, more news vans were arriving. Police cars lined the street, their presence both protection and symbol of the changes to come. Sarah was directing staff members, organizing the press into orderly rows, ensuring everything would run smoothly. And in the governor's study, James stood ready to transform a night of hatred into a movement for change. When Marcus entered, their eyes met in perfect understanding. Toget, her, they would turn this darkness into light, this pain into progress, this moment of cruelty into a catalyst for transformation. The clock struck 8, and the mansion came alive with purposeful energy. In 1 hour, they would step before the cameras and begin the real work of justice. Davidson and his crew might have started this fight, but Marcus and James would finish it. Not with hoses and hatred, but with law and love, with power and purpose, with the unstoppable force of right against wrong. They were ready. The world was watching, and change was coming, as surely as the sun had risen over their city, washing away the darkness of night with the promise of a new day. "Shall we?" James asked, holding out his hand. Marcus took it, feeling the strength of their partnership flow between them. "Let's show them what real power looks like." Together, they headed for the door, ready to face the cameras, the questions, and the challenge of transforming their personal pain into universal progress. The fight for justice was about to begin. The press conference room buzzed with anticipation as James and Marcus approached the podium. Cameras clicked rapidly, their flashes creating a storm of light that seemed to emphasize the gravity of the moment. Sarah had arranged the room perfectly, the American flag on one side, the state flag on the other, and behind them, a large screen ready to display the footage that would shake the foundation of their community. Police Chief Miranda Rodriguez sat in the front row, her face a mask of professional concern masking deeper emotions. Next to her, civil rights leaders and community organizers filled the seats, their presence a testament to how quickly this incident had galvanized the community. The room fell silent as James stepped up to the microphone, Marcus standing solidly at his side. "Good morning," James began, his voice carrying the weight of both personal anguish and official authority. "Last night in our city, something happened that demands not just our attention, but our action. What you are about to see is difficult to watch, but it must be watched, must be acknowledged, and must be addressed." He nodded to Sarah, who started the video. The room collectively held its breath as the footage began to play on the large screen. The crystal-clear images showed every moment of the confrontation. The initial harassment, the escalation, the brutal assault with the fire hose, and finally, James's arrival and subsequent victimization. The sound of running water and cruel laughter filled the room, making the incident impossibly immediate and real. When the footage ended, the silence in the room was deafening. Several journalists were wiping tears from their eyes. Chief Rodriguez's hands were clenched so tight her knuckles had gone white. Marcus could see phones throughout the room lighting up as news outlets began reporting live on social media. "That video," James continued, his voice steady but charged with emotion, "shows more than just an assault on two individuals. It reveals a cancer within our emergency services, a cancer of prejudice, of unchecked power, of the belief that a uniform grants immunity from consequences. Today, we begin the work of cutting out that cancer." He lifted a thick document from the podium. "I am signing Executive Order 2024-147, establishing the Emergency Services Accountability and Reform Initiative. This comprehensive program will implement immediate changes across all emergency service departments in our state." As James detailed the provisions of the executive order, Marcus watched the faces in the crowd. He saw shock when James announced mandatory body cameras for all emergency service personnel, not just police. He saw approval when James outlined the new oversight committee, staffed by civilian representatives and given real power to investigate complaints. And he saw resistance from some of the department heads when James declared zero tolerance for discriminatory behavior, with immediate suspension without pay for credible allegations. "But these measures are just the beginning," James continued, his voice growing stronger. "Today, I am also announcing the creation of the Public Service Integrity Task Force, which will conduct a comprehensive review of all emergency services in our state. This task force will have full investigative powers and will report directly to my office." Marcus stepped forward then, taking his place at the microphone as they had planned. His voice, when he spoke, carried all the emotion of the previous night, tempered by determination and purpose. "Last night, I was assaulted for being who I am, for walking home in my own city. The men who attacked me didn't know I was the governor's husband. They didn't know I was a public servant myself. They saw only what they wanted to see, someone they thought they could victimize with impunity." He paused, letting his words sink in. "But here's what they need to understand, what everyone who abuses their power needs to understand. Every person they've ever harassed, every citizen they've ever bullied, every individual they've made feel small and powerless, they all matter. Today isn't just about what happened to me. It's about ensuring it never happens to anyone else." The questions began then, a flood of them from every corner of the room. James and Marcus handled them with practiced ease, their responses reinforcing their message of systemic change and accountability. When asked about criminal charges against the firefighters, they deferred to the district attorney, who stood to announce that arrest warrants were already being prepared. Chief Rodriguez spoke next, her voice tight with controlled anger as she outlined the police department's role in the investigation. "Let me be clear," she said, "the thin blue line does not extend to covering up abuse of power. We will investigate this incident with the same thoroughness we would apply to any assault case. More thoroughly, in fact, given the breach of public trust involved. As the press conference continued, Marcus felt a subtle shift in the room's energy. The initial shock and outrage were transforming into something more powerful, a sense of purpose, of momentum building toward real change. This wasn't going to be just another scandal that flared bright and faded away. This was going to be a turning point. Sarah appeared at his elbow with a note. Davidson and his crew had been taken into custody without incident. Their expressions, she whispered, had been ones of utter shock when they realized exactly who they had assaulted. But it was too late for regret now. The machinery of justice was already in motion. The press conference stretched into its second hour as James outlined more details of the reforms. Every question was answered, every concern addressed. They were laying the groundwork not just for prosecution of the guilty, but for fundamental change in how emergency services operated and were held accountable. When they finally stepped away from the podium, the room erupted in applause. Not the polite applause of a typical press conference, but the genuine appreciation of people who had just witnessed the beginning of something important. As they made their way through the crowd, supporters reached out to touch them, to offer words of encouragement and promises of support. Outside, the mansion grounds had filled with citizens holding signs of support. News helicopters circled overhead, broadcasting live footage of the growing crowd. Social media was exploding with hashtags demanding justice and reform. The video of their assault had gone viral, spawning thousands of shares and comments, many from people coming forward with their own stories of abuse at the hands of authority figures. Back in James's private office, they finally had a moment alone. Marcus sank into a leather chair, his injured knee throbbing from STA. Ding so long. James poured them both water, a simple act that now carried new weight after last night's events. Phase 1 complete, James said softly, sitting on the edge of his desk. Are you ready for what comes next? Marcus took a sip of water, remembering how it had felt to have it used as a weapon against him. More than ready. They thought they could wash us away, make us disappear. Instead, they've created a flood that's going to sweep away every bit of corruption and abuse in the system. Through the window, they could hear the crowd growing larger, their chants for justice carrying across the mansion grounds. The news channels were running continuous coverage, experts already debating the implications of James's executive order. Phones were ringing throughout the building as other governors called to discuss implementing similar reforms in their states. This was more than just response to one incident now. This was the beginning of a movement, and they were at its heart. Davidson and his crew had tried to teach them a lesson about power. Now they would learn one themselves, about the true nature of power, about justice, and about the strength that comes from standing up against hatred and abuse. Marcus reached for James's hand, drawing strength from their connection. The day was still young, and there was so much work ahead. But they were ready for it, ready to transform their pain into purpose, their anger into action, their experience into lasting change. The real fight was just beginning, and they would see it through to the end. Together, they would build something meaningful from the ashes of last night's cruelty, a legacy of justice that would protect and serve all citizens, regardless of who they were or whom they loved. Outside, the sun continued to climb higher in the sky, its light touching everything, leaving no shadow unexplored, no darkness unchallenged. Just as they would do with their investigation and reforms, illuminating every corner of a broken system until it could be rebuilt, stronger and more just than before. The work of change was beginning, and there would be no turning back. In the weeks that followed, the transformation of their state's emergency services unfolded with a momentum that surprised even James and Marcus. The courthouse became the epicenter of justice as Davidson and his crew faced their preliminary hearings. The scene outside the Justice Building that morning painted a stark picture of the divide their actions had created within the community. On one side stood rows of firefighters in dress uniforms, there to support their colleagues. Though their numbers were notably smaller than expected, a sign that many in the department were distancing themselves from the accused. On the other side, a much larger crowd of citizens held signs demanding accountability, their voices raised in unified calls for justice. Marcus sat in the front row of the courtroom, his hands steady as he watched Davidson and the others being led in, their wrists and ankles shackled. The proud swagger they displayed that night was gone, replaced by slumped shoulders and downcast eyes. Even Davidson, who had seemed so powerful and untouchable while wielding that fire hose, looked small in his orange jumpsuit. The district attorney had built an airtight case. Beyond the viral video, dozens of witnesses had come forward with their own stories of harassment and abuse at the hands of Davidson's crew. The pattern stretched back years. Selective enforcement, targeted harassment, use of emergency equipment as tools of intimidation. The preliminary hearing was supposed to last one day. It stretched into 3 as victim after victim took the stand. James attended when his schedule allowed, his presence a reminder of the gravity of the proceedings. But he was also busy implementing the sweeping reforms promised in his executive order. The Emergency Services Accountability and Reform Initiative was out, already showing results. Body cameras were being distributed to all emergency service personnel, with strict penalties for any equipment that mysteriously malfunctioned during citizen interactions. The Public Service Integrity Task Force had hit the ground running, conducting surprise inspections of fire stations and emergency response units across the state. They discovered a troubling pattern of discriminatory behavior that went far beyond Davidson's crew. But they also found many dedicated public servants who welcomed the oversight, who had been trying to report problems for years but had been stymied by a system designed to protect its own. Marcus threw himself into the work of reform, turning his trauma into fuel for change. He spoke at community meetings, worked with civil rights organizations, and helped draft new training protocols that emphasized de-escalation and cultural sensitivity. His knee still ached in cold weather, a physical reminder of that night, but he refused to let it slow him down. The most surprising ally emerged in the form of Kevin Peters, the young firefighter who had shown hesitation during the assault. He approached Marcus after one of the preliminary hearings, his face drawn with guilt and determination. "I should have stopped them," Peters said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I knew it was wrong, but I was afraid of being ostracized, afraid of retaliation. But that's no excuse." Marcus studied the young man, seeing in him the possibility of redemption. "No, it's not an excuse. But what matters now is what you do going forward." Peters became a key witness for the prosecution, his testimony providing crucial context about the culture of impunity that had developed within the station. More importantly, he became an advocate for change within the department itself, speaking to other young firefighters about the importance of moral courage and the duty to intervene when witnessing abuse. The reforms weren't universally welcomed. Some emergency service veterans complained about increased oversight and paperwork. Others resigned rather than adapt to the new requirements. But for every resignation, there were dozens of applicants eager to join a reformed department, one committed to true public service rather than power and privilege. Sarah kept them updated on the public response, which remained overwhelmingly supportive. The video of their assault had sparked similar investigations in other states, leading to a national conversation about emergency service reform. James was being hailed as a pioneering leader, his executive order becoming a model for other governors. But the most meaningful changes were happening at the ground level. Citizens reported a noticeable difference in their interactions with emergency services. The new Oversight Committee, staffed by civilian representatives from diverse communities, provided real accountability. Complaints were investigated thoroughly, with transparent results and concrete consequences for misconduct. Marcus remembered something James had said the morning after their assault. "We need systemic change." Looking at the transformation taking place around them, he realized they were achieving exactly that. The system that had protected Davidson and his crew was being dismantled, replaced by one built on transparency, accountability, and respect for all citizens. The preliminary hearings concluded with all 6 firefighters being bound over for trial. Davidson faced the most serious charges: assault with a deadly weapon, civil rights violations, abuse of authority. His lawyer attempted to argue that it had been a simple training accident, but the video evidence and witness testimony painted a clear picture of deliberate malicious action. Outside the courthouse, After the judge's ruling, Marcus faced a crowd of reporters. They asked how he felt about the decision, about seeing his attackers in chains, about the prospect of a trial. His answer was measured but firm. This case isn't about revenge. It's about responsibility. Those men betrayed their oath to serve and protect. They used their position and their equipment to attack a citizen they saw as vulnerable. But more importantly, they exposed a systemic problem that needed to be addressed. Their actions, as horrible as they were, created an opportunity for real change. We're seizing that opportunity. Back at the governor's mansion that evening, Marcus and James reviewed the latest reports from the task force. Complaints of misconduct were down 60% since the reforms began. Emergency response times had improved in underserved communities. Public trust was slowly being rebuilt. Davidson's lawyer reached out today. James mentioned, setting aside a thick folder of statistics. They want to discuss a plea deal. Marcus looked up from his own paperwork. What are you thinking? I'm thinking it's not our decision to make. The DA will handle it based on the evidence and the law. That's how the system should work. They shared a smile, understanding the irony. Davidson and his crew had acted as judge, jury, and executioners that night, dispensing their own twisted version of justice. Now they would face real justice, transparent, accountable, and fair. The sun was setting outside their window, casting long shadows across the mansion grounds. But unlike that night weeks ago, these shadows held no threat. They had taken the darkness thrown at them and used it to illuminate the path to change. The work wasn't finished, might never be truly finished, but they had started something important, something lasting. Marcus stood and walked to the window, watching the changing colors in the sky. James joined him, their shoulders touching in comfortable silence. Somewhere in the city, emergency services continued their vital work, but under new rules, new oversight, new expectations. The power they wielded now came with real responsibility and accountability. "We should get ready for dinner," James said softly. "The Civil Rights Commission is waiting." Marcus nodded, but remained at the window for a moment longer. He thought about Davidson, sitting in his cell, probably still not fully understanding how his actions that night had sparked such widespread change. He thought about Peters, working to reform the department from within. He thought about all the citizens who would never know the fear he'd felt that night because of the changes they'd implemented. "Yes," he said finally, turning away from the window. "Let's not keep justice waiting." Together, they headed for the door, ready to continue the work of transformation. The night that had started with an act of hatred had become a catalyst for change, proof that even the darkest moments could lead to light. And they would keep pushing forward, ensuring that the power to protect and serve remained exactly that, a sacred trust, not a weapon to be wielded against the vulnerable. The sun might be setting on this day, but the dawn of justice was just beginning.